Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. I appreciate you being with me so very, very much. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are currently involved in a study of Israel's feast days. We have been focused now for a good little bit on the Sabbath day, the seventh day Sabbath. In other words, Saturday. And we have taken note of the fact that it was a feast day. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 2. Now, attempts are being made. It's not a new attempt, but attempts are being made to delineate between the Sabbath of the Lord, i.e., the seventh day, and the Sabbaths of Moses, or the Sabbaths of Israel. Well, the point of fact is, ladies and gentlemen, God gave all of the Sabbaths, okay? Justification is attempted to be made by saying, well, God spoke the seventh day Sabbath. The others were written down on tablets of stone. Well, so where's the delineation? God gave all of the Sabbaths. He spoke the seventh day, yes, to Moses. Moses wrote it down on the tablets, or if you wish, the Lord wrote it down with his own finger. Those Sabbaths were the foundation of all other Sabbaths. So who gave them? God gave those Sabbaths. To seek to dichotomize or emphasize a singular Sabbath, say, well, this is the Lord's Sabbath, versus all of these other Sabbaths, which are Israel's Sabbaths or Moses' Sabbaths, is simply unjustified. There is no substantive difference because God gave them all. You cannot find anywhere in Scripture in which God said, now the seventh day is mine, the others are Moses, the others are Israel's. In Ezekiel chapter 20, for instance, the entirety of the Sabbaths, the whole collective body of the Sabbaths, if you please, God calls my Sabbaths. Not Israel's, not Moses, my Sabbaths. And so this is a false distinction. It is a false emphasis to try to delineate between, well, the seventh day versus all the rest of the feast days and Sabbaths, because God spoke this one and God didn't speak that one. The rest of them, no. God spoke all of them. God spoke all of them. He is the source of all of them. And so when attempts are made to elevate one Sabbath over the other, because God spoke or God wrote versus Moses wrote, it is forgetting or it is ignoring the fact that God spoke them all. One singular source. And thus, that delineation is false. Now, the last couple of videos, I've been sharing with you about the fact that all of these Sabbaths were shadows of the good things. I've taken note of the fact that the word convocation is used to describe all of them. Well, the word convocation is used in Leviticus chapter 23, meant rehearsal. So when Israel observed the Sabbaths, they were rehearsing for something else. The question, of course, is, what were those Sabbaths, all of them, shadows of? What were they rehearsals of? Well, we're given a little bit of a clue when we talk about Sabbaths being shadows, when a Sabbath was a cessation from labor. So if a physical cessation of labor was the foundation of all of the Sabbaths, then one might just logically extrapolate and say, well, okay, they pointed to one of two different things. Number one, a literal, ultimate cessation from labor. And if you want to literalize things, then you say, well, okay, all of the feast days were Sabbaths or contained Sabbaths, either began or ended in Sabbaths, whichever. But if you want to make that argument, say, well, they pointed to an ultimate end of all physical labor, then you're either talking about physical death or you're talking about a state of being in which there is no labor whatsoever. Physical labor. Or there's the distinct possibility that the concept of cessation of labor might point to a cessation of spiritual labor. Now, here's something very, very fascinating. There are a couple of different words used in the Greek, the Septuagint of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. They are kataposis and anaposis. Both of those words are used to speak of Sabbath rest, the literal cessation of physical rest under Torah on the seventh day during the feast days. But Jesus used those very words. The New Testament uses those words to speak of spiritual cessation from spiritual labor, of the burden of the law, in other words. In Matthew chapter 11, 28 and 29, Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That form of word, anaposis or kataposis, I've forgotten precisely which one all of a sudden. Apologize for that. But the point of it is, he is using a form of the word that is used in the Old Testament to speak of Sabbath rest. Now, was Jesus saying, okay, if you'll come to me, you don't have to do any physical labor anymore? Well, I'm sorry, that won't work, because Paul in 2 Thessalonians condemned some in the church who believed that because the Lord had already come, they had stopped working physically. Well, hey, after all, Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you that labor, and I'll give you rest." That must mean cessation from physical labor. Christ has come, therefore I get to stop working. I'll make the church support me. Well, how's the church going to support you if everybody in the church stopped working? So anaposis and kataposis, when used of Christ and his work, Christ, who is the fulfillment of all of the types and the shadows, did not point to a cessation of physical labor. That's not the point. Furthermore, we are given insight into this in Hebrews chapter 9 and into chapter 10. That is to say, we are given insight into the kind of rest, the kind of cessation from labor that the literal Sabbaths pointed to. Hebrews chapter 9 describes the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, under the law. On that day, the high priest killed a sacrifice. He took the blood of that sacrifice into the most holy place, and he returned again to announce salvation for the awaiting crowd. Okay? The writer of Hebrews delineates the work of Christ as the great high priest, and he says, now once at the end of the ages, Christ has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Jesus is the high priest functioning in the role of Yom Kippur, the high priestly works on the Day of Atonement. And Hebrews 9:24, Christ has entered into the most holy place To do what? To offer his life, the blood being the life. And to those who eagerly wait for him, he shall appear a second time, apart from sin, for what? Salvation. So here we have type and antitype, shadow versus reality, and what the Old Testament Day of Atonement pointed to. And remember, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was a Sabbath. It was the most important feast in all of Israel's calendar, according to Jewish histories. So this day, the most important feast in all of Israel's feast days, was a type and a shadow of the coming ultimate atonement. And here's Hebrews pointing to Jesus as the great high priest doing that atonement practice, functions. The Old Testament priest was doing those things in order to demonstrate coming salvation, because into chapter 10 now, watch this. This is critical. Unto those, again, chapter 9, verse 28, all right? To those who eagerly, from the Greek word apekdekomai, and that's an eager, earnest, expectant looking. It is not a saying of, yes, it'll happen one of these days. No. That is an expectation of an imminent realization to those who eagerly look for him. Well, why were they eagerly looking for him, ladies and gentlemen? Two reasons. He shall appear again the second time, apart from sin, for salvation. They were eagerly looking for him because he was going to bring the salvation foreshadowed by the high priest under the old covenant in the Day of Atonement praxis. Salvation foretold, salvation foreshadowed, salvation realized at the coming of the Lord the second time. So Christ was going to come in fulfillment of Yom Kippur to bring the reality of salvation, what the Old Testament Day of Atonement foreshadowed. But you see, what the Old Testament Day of Atonement foreshadowed, it could not give. Look, I've got to make this comment. A little bit of a digression, but not really. I am actually stunned over and over and over again when people tell me, and people claim, they actually objectively had forgiveness under the old law. Really? Then why did Jesus need to come? If the blood of bulls and goats actually, literally, objectively took away sin, then why did Jesus have to come? Now watch Hebrews chapter 10. After describing the functions of the high priest on Yom Kippur and describing Jesus' work as a great high priest, he says, for, Greek word gar, it's a connective particle. Here's the reason why Christ was about to come for salvation. For the law, that's the old covenant law. For the law, having a shadow of the good things, now watch this, about to come. Well, what were the things that he had predicted were coming? The coming of Christ, the second time, for salvation. Unto those who eagerly look for him, he will appear again the second time for salvation, for the law having a shadow of the good things, now watch this, about to come. The second reason they were eagerly looking for him is told to us, in chapter 10, verse 37. And now, in a very, very little while, the Greek there is extremely emphatic, The one who is coming. Well, who is the only one that he has mentioned who is coming? The one who is coming will come, and he will not delay. The literal of this verse is, in a very, very little while, the one who is coming will come and will not delay. And yet, futurists tell us, well, I know it says in just a very, very little while, he will come, he will not delay, but he hasn't come in 2,000 years. It absolutely makes a mockery of language. Oh, and of course, people say, well, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years. Well, it also says, the very same text they quote, says 1,000 years are a day, as a day. It doesn't say God can't tell time. Okay, so the second reason that they were eagerly looking for him was because the promise was he was coming in a very, very little while. But here's the point. Did you catch the fact, did you catch the power that Christ was to appear a second time apart from sin for salvation? For, we can render that, because Christ was coming, because the law was a shadow. The actions of the high priest were shadows of the good things that were just about to take place. That's what the Day of Atonement foreshadowed, the coming of Christ for salvation. Now notice that he continues, and I got to hurry here. He continues. The blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. Could never take away sin. And yet we're told, oh yeah, they had forgiveness. Literal, actual, objective forgiveness under the old law. Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, then Jesus didn't have to come. But in the offering of those sacrifices, watch this, which they make year by year continually, oh, their sins are forgiven. No, there is a remembrance of sin. Not a removal, a remembrance. Why? For, there's that connected particle again, for the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. For if the worshiper, the one who offered the sacrifices, was ever once purged, then those sacrifices would cease to be offered. So if those people under the law were objectively, truly forgiven, then they didn't need to make those sacrifices anymore. You see the problem? So what's my point? The point is, for instance, the Day of Atonement was a shadow of the good things that were about to come. The good things that were about to come was forgiveness of sin. That Sabbath pointed toward the release, the refreshment of, the release from sin, the refreshment of conscience, freedom, rest from sin. And that's not all that it foreshadowed. But listen to me. I told you, and I'm sorry for the delay of this, I was going to have an absolutely fantastic 2-book special for you. These books are my 2 newest books. These are the days in which all things that are written must be fulfilled, and Resurrection Feast, pardon me, Resurrection Feast fulfilled. Now, if you purchase each one of these separately, just the books would cost you over $45, almost $46, plus $14 postage. All right? For the rest of March 2024, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $39.95. That's going to save you $20. Okay? $20 savings. So go to my website, DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, tab at the top, click on it, Save yourself $20 and you'll see what marvelous power there is in realizing Israel's feast days, every single one of them, are fulfilled. Hey, I'm out of time. I'll see you on the flip side.